In 1976, the Hollywood industry was riding high on ambition and hubris, convinced that bigger budgets and star-studded casts guaranteed box office gold. Studios gambled millions on prestigious biopics, international co-productions, and nostalgia-fueled comedies. What they got instead was a spectacular parade of financial catastrophes that would leave executives scrambling and careers in ruins. From ill-conceived comedies to misguided tributes, these weren't just flops. They were expensive lessons in what happens when Hollywood loses touch with its audience. Let's dive straight into it and talk about the 13 biggest box office disasters from 1976. Malcolm McDowell had already established himself as a compelling screen presence, but his 1976 World War I aerial drama proved that even talent couldn't overcome fundamental miscalculation. The film attempted to transplant the trench warfare of the acclaimed stage play Journey's End into the skies above France, following a Royal Flying Corps squadron where rookie pilots faced horrifying mortality rates. Christopher Plummer, Simon Ward, and Peter Firth rounded out the cast, lending gravitas to this Anglo-French production that EMI Films co-financed as part of an ambitious slate worth up to £7 million. Director Jack Gold aimed for psychological depth mixed with aerial combat spectacle, but the result satisfied neither camp. The dogfight sequences used authentic World War I equipment and even incorporated footage from earlier aviation films, yet critics remained unconvinced. Some praised the anti-war message and authentic portrayal of young pilots facing almost certain demise, but others dismissed it as a shrill anti-establishment squawk that failed to justify its existence. McDowell himself later admitted the fatal flaw. The film contained too much action for a true psychological drama, but nowhere near enough to work as a proper action thriller. Audiences stayed away, leaving this expensive production grounded at the box office. The film's failure highlighted a harsh truth. Historical prestige alone couldn't fill theater seats, especially when the execution left viewers unsure what kind of movie they were actually watching. James Coburn's attempt at an action thriller became infamous for reasons that had nothing to do with ticket sales. Set against the breathtaking backdrop of the Meteora monasteries in Greece, the film featured a genuinely novel premise. Terrorists kidnap an industrialist's family and hide them in a mountaintop fortress, forcing the heroes to recruit hang-gliding circus performers for an aerial rescue mission. It should have been thrilling. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about what can go wrong when ambition outpaces execution. The production faced immediate tragedy when a staged explosion went catastrophically wrong. Flames that were supposed to reach 50 feet soared to 150 feet instead, resulting in the passing of a Greek electrician and injuring a dozen crew members. Producer Terry Morse Jr. found himself arrested, while producer Sandy Howard was detained for weeks. A $250,000 settlement followed, one that Variety openly called a bribe to keep the responsible party out of prison under the military regime. The scandal overshadowed everything else about the film. When Skywriters finally reached American theaters, it flopped spectacularly, earning a mere $1.73 million domestically. Critics acknowledged the impressive hang-gliding sequences, but dismissed the plot as something any reasonably bright 9-year-old could have managed. The film performed better internationally, but not enough to offset its troubled production. Years later, screenwriter Jack Hill, hired to write a sequel that never materialized, explained the core problem. They had the theory that it should be wall-to-wall action, and there is nothing more boring. The lesson was clear. Non-stop action without stakes or character development leaves audiences numb rather than excited. Charlton Heston seemed to have cornered the market on disaster films throughout the 70s. After Earthquake, Skyjacked, Airport 75, and Grey Lady Down, he returned with another high-concept thriller about a psychotic sniper targeting fans at a packed championship football game in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Universal Studios released it strategically on November 12, 1976, right in the heart of NFL season, hoping sports fans would flock to see this tense cat-and-mouse game between police and a mysterious marksman. The film assembled an impressive ensemble cast, including John Cassavetes as a SWAT commander, Martin Balsam, Jack Klugman, Gina Rowlands, and David Jansen. Director Larry Pierce filmed actual crowd scenes during a college football game between Stanford and USC, employing thousands of background performers. During the filming of a stampede sequence, several extras sustained minor injuries, and Pierce publicly complained about their performances, sparking backlash from those who'd worked under difficult conditions. Despite an Oscar nomination for Best Film Editing, the film struggled with critics and audiences alike. It currently holds a dismal 29% on Rotten Tomatoes. Reviewers found the violence shocking but gratuitous, the characters underdeveloped, and the sniper's lack of motivation frustrating rather than mysterious. When NBC negotiated to air the film on television, they demanded 40 additional minutes of footage explaining that the sniper was merely a decoy for an art heist next door. Pierce refused to participate and publicly disowned this version, which credited editor Gene Palmer as director instead. The theatrical version had been moved from a July release date specifically to beat a similarly themed film called Black Sunday to theaters, but the strategy backfired. 2-minute warning never found its audience, proving that disaster film fatigue had finally set in. Some failures are merely disappointing. Others become legendary for their sheer awfulness. Michael Winner's comedy nostalgia piece somehow managed to assemble over 50 Golden Age Hollywood stars for cameo appearances, then spectacularly waste every single one of them. The premise had potential. A struggling actress in 1920s Hollywood teams up with a talented German shepherd who becomes a bigger star than any human, parodying the Rin Tin Tin phenomenon while celebrating silent cinema's glory days. What arrived in theaters was an unfunny, tonally confused mess that critics absolutely savaged. The film currently holds a catastrophic 14% on Rotten Tomatoes. Richard Eder of the New York Times noted that only Madeline Kahn's performance saved the film from complete disaster, though even her considerable talent couldn't overcome the material. Other reviewers were far less charitable. One called it reinforced concrete where it should have been cotton candy. Another dubbed it the dog who savaged Hollywood instead of saved it. The Los Angeles Times declared that 60 guest stars can't save this disaster from its unrelentingly crass tone. The film tried to be family-friendly while including sexual harassment, attempted assault, and bizarre sequences of the dog attempting self-harm. Bruce Dern, Madeline Kahn, Art Carney, and Ron Liebman delivered performances that were described as extravagantly bad, as if grimaces and gesticulations would conceal the script's inadequacies. Most tragically, Wonton Ton became the final film appearance for 13 legendary performers, including Rudy Vallee, Andy Devine, Johnny Weissmuller, Stepin Fetchit, and Peter Lawford. These icons of entertainment history deserved better than to have their careers end in this cinematic train wreck. Audiences wanted genuine nostalgia. Films like That's Entertainment proved that, not this cynical, poorly executed parody. The box office reflected their rejection. Rod Steiger took on the challenge of portraying legendary comedian W.C. Fields, but the biographical drama became another entry in 1976's parade of failed Hollywood biopics. The film attempted to explore Fields' complicated personal life and professional career, but critics lumped it together with other weirdly miscalculated projects that seemed to misunderstand what audiences wanted from stories about old Hollywood legends. The Washington Post grouped it with films like Gable and Lombard and Wonton Ton, noting they all shared a crass, insecure, and condescending approach to Hollywood history. Rather than capturing Fields' anarchic genius and misanthropic wit, the film delivered a conventional, sanitized biography that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. Steiger's performance, while committed, couldn't overcome a script that never found the right tone. Should it be reverent, critical, comedic? The film never decided, leaving audiences with a muddled portrait that satisfied no one. Fields deserved better, and so did moviegoers, who stayed away in droves. Margaux Hemingway's acting debut turned into one of 1976's most uncomfortable misfires. The assault revenge thriller cast the supermodel alongside her younger sister Marielle in a controversial story that attempted to tackle serious subject matter but never found the right approach. Was it exploitation, social commentary, empowerment, fantasy? The film couldn't commit to any single vision, resulting in a tonal disaster that critics and audiences rejected. The Hemingway name recognition couldn't translate into box office success. Margaux lacked the acting experience to anchor such difficult material, and the script failed to provide the support she needed. The film wanted to make important statements about justice and trauma, but its execution felt simultaneously exploitative and preachy. Critics found the whole enterprise distasteful, and word of mouth was brutal. In an era when films like Network and All the President's Men were tackling complex themes with sophistication, Lipstick felt clumsy and dated. The sisters would both go on to better work, but this debut remains a cautionary tale about matching inexperienced performers with material beyond their capabilities. Ambition doesn't guarantee success, as this unprecedented US-Soviet co-production proved spectacularly. Elizabeth Taylor headlined this adaptation of the Morris Maeterlinck play, marking the first major collaboration between American and Soviet filmmakers. The symbolic fairy tale about children searching for the bluebird of happiness seemed like safe, universal material that could bridge Cold War divides while showcasing technical and artistic cooperation. Instead, the production became a bloated nightmare plagued by cultural clashes, political tensions, and fundamental disagreements about storytelling approaches. The massive budget swelled as filming dragged on, with language barriers and different working methods creating constant complications. Taylor's star power, which had commanded million-dollar salaries throughout the 60s, couldn't overcome the film's confused vision and ponderous pacing. When The Bluebird finally reached theaters, it failed on both sides of the Iron Curtain. American audiences found it slow, pretentious, and visually unappealing despite the money spent on production design. Soviet audiences had their own complaints about the finished product. Critics were ruthless, and the film became a punchline about misguided internationalism. The noble experiment in cinematic diplomacy instead proved that some cultural gaps were too wide to bridge, especially when the foundation was this weak. Taylor recovered from the embarrassment, but the film remains one of cinema's most spectacular examples of good intentions producing terrible results. Robert Shaw's star had risen meteorically after his riveting performance as Quint in Jaws, and studios scrambled to capitalize on his newfound box office appeal. Universal greenlit this pirate adventure, hoping Shaw's intensity and screen presence could revive the moribund swashbuckler genre. The film paired him with James Earl Jones and Genevieve Bujold in a story of Caribbean buccaneers fighting corrupt governors in the 1700s. But where Jaws had benefited from a brilliant script, innovative direction, and genuine suspense, Swashbuckler offered nothing but tired genre cliches. The sword fights felt choreographed rather than dangerous. The romance lacked chemistry. The villains were one-dimensional caricatures. Shaw tried to bring gravitas to the material, but even his considerable talents couldn't elevate the formulaic story. The film felt like a throwback to the Errol Flynn era without understanding what made those films work. Audiences who'd thrilled to Shaw's battle with the great white shark found nothing to engage them here. The pirate genre had fallen out of favor for good reason. The tales felt repetitive and dated, the heroes too uncomplicated for modern sensibilities. Swashbuckler proved that post-Jaws success didn't automatically transfer to any project. Shaw's career continued, but this misfire showed that star power needed strong material as foundation. Without that, even the most compelling actor becomes just another element in a forgettable failure. When legendary director Elia Kazan announced his return to filmmaking after a 7-year absence, expectations soared. The source material was impeccable. F. Scott Fitzgerald's unfinished novel about Hollywood's golden age. The cast was extraordinary. Robert De Niro, fresh off Taxi Driver, Jack Nicholson at the height of his powers, Robert Mitchum, Jean Moreau, and Tony Curtis. Harold Pinter adapted the screenplay. This had all the ingredients of a masterpiece. Instead, it became Kazan's disappointing swan song. The film moved at a glacial pace, spending enormous running time on scenes that should have crackled with energy, but instead felt lifeless. De Niro's performance as the brilliant but troubled producer Monroe Starr was internal and subtle, but the role needed more fire. Nicholson appeared barely engaged. The recreation of 1930s. Hollywood looked expensive but felt sterile, like a museum exhibition rather than a living, breathing world. Critics who'd championed Kazan's earlier masterpieces like On the Waterfront and A Streetcar named Desire struggled to reconcile this ponderous exercise with his legacy. The film never captured the tragedy of Fitzgerald's vision or the ruthless glamour of Hollywood's studio era. It wasn't offensively bad, just disappointingly hollow. Audiences expecting prestige drama found boredom instead. For Kazan, it was a melancholy finale to one of cinema's greatest directing careers. The Last Tycoon taught a hard lesson. Even legends with perfect material and unlimited resources can miscalculate catastrophically. Hollywood's obsession with its own history produced another disaster with this biographical drama about the legendary romance between Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. James Brolin and Jill Clayburgh took on the iconic roles, attempting to capture the passion and wit of one of the movie's greatest love stories. The real Gable and Lombard had been magnetic together. Their relationship tragically cut short when Lombard perished in a plane crash in 1942, while selling war bonds. The film version captured none of that magic. Brolin and Clayburgh, both capable actors, were simply miscast. They couldn't conjure the chemistry that made the real couple so compelling, nor could they overcome a script that sanitized and romanticized the relationship beyond recognition. The production values looked cheap despite the budget spent on period recreation. Director Sidney J. Furie never found the right tone. Scenes that should have sparkled with sophistication felt forced and artificial. Critics savaged the film as part of the year's trend of tacky exercises in mock nostalgia that revealed New Hollywood at its most crass, insecure, and condescending. Audiences who remembered the real Gable and Lombard felt insulted by this hollow imitation. Younger viewers simply didn't care enough about old Hollywood romance to give it a chance. The box office disaster confirmed what Wantantan and Fields and Me had already proven. 1976 audiences didn't want Hollywood navel-gazing disguised as entertainment. They wanted authentic stories, not glossy recreations that felt like bad dinner theater. Peter Bogdanovich had been the golden boy of New Hollywood, delivering critical and commercial successes with The Last Picture Show, What's Up, Doc, and Paper Moon. His loving tribute to silent cinema should have been another triumph. With Ryan O'Neal, Burt Reynolds, and Tatum O'Neal heading the cast, the film recreated the chaotic, creative early days of movie-making with elaborate period detail and genuine affection for cinema history. But Bogdanovich's nostalgia trip left audiences cold. The episodic story meandered without focus, spending too much time on inside jokes and references that only film historians could appreciate. Reynolds and O'Neal tried for screwball energy but never achieved genuine chemistry. The film's loving recreation of silent film techniques, pratfalls, chases, last-minute rescues, felt more like museum pieces than entertainment. What worked for the actual pioneers of cinema felt stale and affected in 1976. The critical response was devastating. Reviewers who championed Bogdanovich's earlier work expressed bewilderment at this self-indulgent exercise. The box office performance was equally brutal. Nickelodeon marked the beginning of Bogdanovich's decline from A-list director to cautionary tale. His career never fully recovered, and the film remains a prime example of how passion projects can destroy reputations when the filmmaker loses objectivity. Audiences didn't want lectures about cinema history disguised as entertainment. They wanted the thing itself. Great storytelling. Nickelodeon confused love of movies with actual movie making. When you put Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson together in a Western directed by Arthur Penn, yes, audiences stayed away from what should have been a can't-miss pairing. The Missouri Breaks cost a fortune to produce and barely recouped its investment. It proved that star power without discipline equals expensive chaos. The Western genre was dying anyway, but this didn't help. Robert Altman closed out 1976's Western disasters with his deconstructionist take on Wild West mythology. Paul Newman starred as Buffalo Bill Cody, the showman who built a career exaggerating his own frontier exploits. The film aimed to expose the gap between legend and reality, showing how American heroes were manufactured rather than born. Altman filled the cast with character actors and brought his signature overlapping dialogue and cynical worldview to the material. But cynicism alone doesn't make compelling cinema. The film moved at a crawl, spending enormous screen time making points that could have been made more efficiently. Newman was miscast as the vainglorious Cody, lacking the braggadocio the role required. Altman's experimental approach, which had worked brilliantly in Nashville and McCabe and Mrs. Miller, here felt like pretentious self-importance masquerading as insight. The revisionist Western subgenre had already worn out its welcome, and Buffalo Bill did nothing to revive interest. Critics were mixed at best. Audiences were openly hostile. The film died at the box office, taking down any remaining hope that Westerns could be viable in the modern marketplace. For Altman, it was a rare misfire from a director who'd pushed boundaries throughout his career. For the Western genre, it was another nail in the coffin. The film's failure perfectly encapsulated 1976's larger problem: filmmakers making movies for themselves rather than audiences, assuming their artistic vision would automatically translate to commercial success. 1976 proved beyond doubt that star power, prestigious directors, and massive budgets couldn't guarantee box office success. The year marked the end of multiple trends that had defined early 70s cinema. The disaster film cycle that began with Airport and The Poseidon Adventure had finally exhausted audience patience. Hollywood's obsession with its own history, all those self-congratulatory biopics and nostalgic comedies, revealed itself as navel-gazing that viewers found tedious rather than enlightening. Traditional westerns, even when deconstructed by brilliant directors, couldn't overcome the genre's fundamental decline in relevance.